Salam, peace be upon you. We have been walking across a silent ground, step by step, sealing locks that stop us from drifting into story and calling it science. In part 32, we learned the first hard discipline. Public knowledge exists only inside finite windows. No window, no public truth. In part 33, we installed the next gate. A window becomes readable only if coherence crosses a threshold gamma. Below gamma, it is not mysterious signal, it is just noise. In part 34, we accepted the deeper humility. Finite observers can extract only finite statements from phi's infinite depth. Infinite depth, finite reach. In part 35, we built the bridge that turns guesses into certified claims. Uncertainty budget, noise model, replication protocol, explicit scope. No error bars, no science. Now we arrive at part 36. And part 36 is a quiet bomb. Because now we ask a question that most people never ask clearly. What kind of thing can count as a public observable at all? Not what do you believe exists, not what is ultimately real, but what kind of mathematical content can actually survive the public game? Measurement, repetition, communication, reconstruction by strangers? This part is called the Finite Jet Sufficiency Principle. Its core claim? Public observables are finite jet functionals of phi, meaning what we can publicly measure depends only on finite order change information, a finite stack of derivatives. The infinite tower remains potential, real in capacity but not operationally cacheable. Or, in the simplest sentence, public reality is finite derivative. And this is not just because we are not smart enough. It is not because our technology is weak. It is not because the universe is hiding. It is because publicness has a shape. A public claim must be 1. Measurable, 2. Repeatable, 3. Communicable, 4. Reconstructible by others. And each of those 4 requirements acts like a knife that cuts the infinite tower down to a finite bundle. That is what we will show today, through simple examples you already understand. Mountains, carpets, weather, radios, maps, and music. And we will make it firewalled. Prediction and falsification will be the spine, not decoration. Imagine an enormous mountain. Not just a pretty mountain you take a photo of. A mountain with bottomless detail. From far away, it has a silhouette. Closer, you see ridges. Closer, you see rocks. Closer, cracks. Closer, grains of sand. Closer, crystal structure. Closer, atoms. Closer, vibrations. Every zoom reveals more structure, and there is no obvious final layer you can confidently call the end. This mountain is like phi in part 12, infinite depth. Now suppose I ask you to make a map of this mountain so that other people can use it. You understand immediately. If your map tries to include everything, your map must become the mountain itself. It would be too heavy to carry, too large to read, too detailed to share. So what do? You take finite information. You draw the outline of the mountain, the slopes, the curvature, maybe a few additional features. And then you stop. You stop not because the mountain stopped having detail. You stop because a map is a public object. And the public object must be manageable. This is the first intuition of Part 36. Public observables are like maps. They record only a finite level of change information. Now, let's name that change information in simple everyday language. If I tell you, the road is here, that is one layer. If I tell you, the road is steep here, that is an extra layer. If I tell you, the steepness is changing fast here, that is another. Each layer is about how something changes. Mathematicians call these layers derivatives. And the collected stack, value, slope, curvature, and so on, up to some finite level, they call a jet. A jet is not mystical. A jet is just how many layers of how it changes are we keeping. So let's translate jet into a picture that needs no math at all. Consider a moving car on a road. If I only tell you where the car is, you have one layer, position. If I tell you where it is and how fast it's going, you have two layers. If I tell you where it is, how fast, and whether it's speeding up or slowing down, you have three layers. If I add how the acceleration is changing, that is another. At some point, you stop. Because if you demand the infinite stack, how acceleration changes and how that change changes and how that change changes without end, then you are not describing a car anymore. You are demanding an infinite book. And you cannot measure an infinite book in finite time. This brings us to the claim again. Public observables depend only on finite jets, finite stacks of derivatives. The infinite jet exists as possibility, but it does not cash out as public measurement. Now we connect this to the factory, because you asked for the story to be both rigorous and alive. I return to the rug factory beneath hell. We had our glass in part 32, the window. We had our gamma threshold in part 33, the line where pattern becomes readable. We had our finite reach in part 34, finite beings making finite claims. We had our discipline in part 35, error bars, noise models, replication recipes, scope. Now imagine a carpet in progress. A carpet is not just a carpet. It is an object with layered structure. At the coarsest scale, you see color regions. Closer, you see motif repetition. Closer, you see knot regularity. Closer, you see thread twist. Closer, you see fiber texture. And in principle, it goes deeper, down to dyes, molecules, and so on. Now ask, how do we publicly certify that the carpet matches the master pattern? We do not do it by saying, I certify that every possible microscopic feature at every scale matches perfectly. That would be impossible. It would require infinite inspection time and infinite inspection criteria. Instead, we do what real public knowledge always does. We choose finite inspection levels. We look at knot density in a sampled square, alignment of motifs across a certain span, color matching under specified light, edge binding quality along a finite segment. We do not go to infinite detail. We build a certificate with finite tests. That certificate is a finite jet claim in practice. It depends on a finite set of features, a finite stack of how it changes across the fabric. And here is the deeper point. A carpet can have infinite micro detail, but public carpet quality is always finite feature. Not because reality is shallow, because public certification is finite. Now let's make the principle clean and formal in listener language. Phi has infinite depth, but a public observable must be measured by a finite instrument, recorded as finite data, shared as finite description, reconstructed by finite procedures. Each of these is a finite knife. So the public world is not everything that is. The public world is everything that can be repeatedly extracted and shared. And what can be repeatedly extracted and shared must be finite structured. That is part 36. The prediction. If part 36 is true, we should expect a strong universal pattern. No measurable quantity will require infinite order derivatives for its definition. Not it will be hard, not we don't yet know how, but it will never be required. Any quantity that is truly measurable will always admit a definition in terms of some finite number of derivative layers, plus the part 35 discipline. This prediction is bold because it forbids a whole class of claims. It says, if someone says, my theory is scientific, but you must use infinite derivatives to define the observable, then one of two things must happen. One, they will eventually reformulate it into finite jet observables, and then it becomes science. Or two, it will remain forever outside public science, and then it is not falsifiable knowledge. This prediction is the firewall against infinite subtlety stories that never cash out. The falsification. How could part 36 be wrong? Very cleanly. Exhibit an experimentally reconstructible quantity that provably requires infinite order derivatives. Not a poetic claim. Not it feels infinite. Not the math is infinite. A public science falsification requires an observable, a measurement procedure, a replication protocol, a reconstruction method others can perform, and a proof that no finite derivative definition can capture it. If you can do that, part 36 falls. If you cannot, part 36 stands as a structural law of public knowledge. Now we do what good firewalls do. We try to break ourselves. We attempt to find candidates that seem to require infinity, and we test them against the public rules. Candidate 1. The exact value of pi in nature. Someone might say, pi has infinite decimals, so surely some measurements requires infinite detail. But what does an experiment do? It never measures pi exactly. It measures ratios, circumference to diameter, or wave modes, or geometrical relations. And every measurement is finite. Pi approximates 3.14159 plus or minus 0.00001 under these conditions. That is finite. That is disciplined. That is replicable. So pi is not a counterexample. It confirms part 36. Because the public output is always finite precision, hence finite jet. Candidate 2. Fractals and coastlines. A coastline has detail upon detail. If you zoom in, it keeps roughening. People say, this is infinite structure. True, in potential. But in public measurement, what do? You choose a range of scales and compute an estimate. Fractal dimension approximal 1.23 plus or minus 0.02 over these scales, using this method. Finite scales, finite data, finite estimator. So again, infinite potential, finite public observable, not falsification. Candidate 3. Quantum state tomography. People imagine the quantum state contains infinite information. But real tomography is always finite. Finite number of measurement settings, finite number of trials, finite reconstruction algorithm, finite reported uncertainty. Even when the underlying object is described by infinite math, The observable content is finite. Again, no falsification. Candidate 4. The wave function itself. This is the most tempting mistake. We think, surely the wave function is the full reality, so science measures it. But public science never outputs the full wave function as an infinite object. It outputs probabilities, expectation values, correlations, cross sections, interference fringes, spectra peaks. All of those are finite jet functionals, finite extractions. The wave function is like the mountain's infinite micro detail. Science shares the map. So again, not falsification. So far, every attempt collapses into the same truth. When it becomes public, it becomes finite. This is not a weakness. This is the definition of what we call measurement. Now let's make this visceral with an everyday object, a radio. You tune an old radio. Static hisses everywhere. At first, there is nothing. Then you hear something faint. Then it becomes clear. That was part 33, gamma, the detection threshold. Now imagine someone says, but the real broadcast contains infinite detail. If you could capture infinite derivatives of the waveform, you would hear the perfect message. But the radio does not work that way. A radio has finite bandwidth, finite sampling, finite amplifier precision, finite noise. The message becomes public only through what survives these finite channels. You do not need infinite derivatives to recover the song. If you did, no song would ever be shareable. The fact that songs are shareable tells you something deep. What matters publicly is always finite capturable. So the finite jet principle is not just a physics claim. It is a claim about what it means for something to be shared at all. Now a map example again, but sharper. Take any printed map. A map is a claim, a public claim. But it only works because it states scale, legend, projection, date, region. It does not contain every bump in the road. It contains enough finite structure to be useful. Now imagine someone wants to improve the map by demanding infinite detail. They demand, give me a map that includes every pebble and every blade of grass. You see the absurdity. That is not a map. That is a duplication of the territory. So here is the deep rule. Public description cannot equal reality in infinite detail without ceasing to be public, because public requires finite handling. This is the operational reason behind part 36. Now we connect part 36 to part 35 explicitly, because this is where many people get lost. Part 35 said, no error bars, no science. Ask yourself, what is the error bar of the 10,000th derivative of a function at a point? Even to define that derivative robustly from data, you would need absurd precision and stability. In practice, you are dominated by noise long before. So disciplined science naturally lives in finite derivatives, because uncertainty budgeting lives there. In other words, finite jets are the only place where error bars make operational sense. So part 35 and part 36 are interlocked. Part 35 gives the certification rule. Part 36 tells you what kind of object can be certified. Now we offer the cleanest intuitive picture for listeners. The two realms. Realm 1, infinite potential. Phase full depth, the complete tower, all possible derivative structure. This is what reality can contain. Realm 2, finite public. What we can measure, repeat, share, and reconstruct. This is what science can certify. Part 36 says, Realm 2 is finite jet by nature. Science does not deny Realm 1. Science simply refuses to pretend it can publicly claim Realm 1 in full. That refusal is not ignorance, it is integrity. Now I want to show you a very simple reason finite jets are sufficient that goes straight back to part 3, comparability. Public knowledge requires comparison, and comparison requires deciding same versus different. But what does same mean if you demand infinite content? To prove two things are exactly the same in infinite detail, you would need to check infinitely many features. That is impossible in finite time. So in public life, same always means same up to some finite standard. Same temperature within tolerance. Same pattern within specification. Same waveform within resolution. Same outcome within confidence interval. That is how public knowledge operates. So the very logic of comparison forces truncation. And truncation is what finite jet is. So part 36 is not a random math preference. It is the inevitable consequence of public comparability. Let's make it even simpler with a human example. You meet a friend after many years. You say, "You're the same person." Are they identical in every detail? No. Their cells changed. Their memories changed. Their body changed. What do you mean by same? You mean same enough under some finite features you care about. Voice, face, mannerisms, story continuity. Public identity itself is finite feature. If you demanded infinite sameness, you could never recognize anyone, ever. So even social reality runs on finite jets. Now I want to tie this to actual physics without becoming technical. Notice something. The core laws we write in physics are typically finite order differential equations. They talk about positions and velocities and accelerations, fields and their gradients and curvatures, first and second derivatives often. Sometimes a bit higher, but still finite. This is not an accident. It is what public observables supports. If a physical theory required an infinite order object to define its observable output, it would not be a public theory. It would not be certifiable. So part 36 quietly explains a deep regularity. Science naturally lives in finite order change. Not because reality is shallow, but because measurement is finite. Now we return to the factory one last time, because the factory is the listener's anchor. Imagine the master weaver says, "I can certify this carpet only if I examine the infinite microscopic structure of every fiber." Everyone laughs. Not because the carpet has no microscopic structure, but because certification has a purpose: to be shared and acted upon. The master weaver instead says, "I certify this carpet under these tests, in these windows, with these tolerances." That is public knowledge, a finite jet certificate. And if someone disputes it, we do not debate metaphysics. We repeat the finite tests. This is part 36 embodied. The danger. Part 36 prevents. Part 36 is a firewall against a very common trick. Someone makes a claim that seems scientific, but when you ask for the observable, they say, "It exists in an infinitely subtle form you cannot measure." That is the move that dissolves falsification. It makes the claim immune. Part 36 says, if it cannot cash out in finite jet observables, finite procedures producing finite results, then it is not public science. It may be poetry. It may be private metaphysics. It may be inspiration, but it is not a certified public claim. This is why part 36 is a lock. It prevents science from leaking into fantasy through the back door called infinity. The prediction again in everyday form. If part 36 is true, then whenever you see a successful measurable quantity, you should be able to point to a finite window, part 32, coherence above gamma, part 33, a finite statement, part 34, an uncertainty budget and protocol, part 35, and a finite derivative dependence, part 36. And the more someone insists on infinite order dependence, the more their claim will fail public reconstruction. The falsification again in everyday form. If someone can build a device such that it outputs an observable, others can replicate it, and the observable provably requires infinite order derivatives to even define, then part 36 is wrong. So far, in every domain we actually know how to make public, the observable collapses back to finite order quantities. Now we give the listener the carry, because every part must leave a single tool in the pocket. Here it is. Public reality is finite derivative. Or, even more concrete, when someone claims they measured something, ask, what finite features did you actually measure? What finite derivatives did your instrument access? What finite output did you record? What finite protocol can another person follow? If there is no finite answer, there is no public observable. And now we build the bridge forward. We have now installed windows, gamma threshold, finite access, estimation discipline, and finite jet sufficiency. Notice what we are building, a complete pre-dynamic measurement grammar. We are not yet telling a story of how the universe evolves. We are building the rules of what it means to speak publicly at all. And part 36 sets up the next natural lock. If public observables are finite jet, then public truth must travel through shared comparator chains, procedures others can reconstruct step by step. That is part 37. But for now, hold this. The mountain is infinitely detailed. The map is finite. The map is not a lie. It is the only shareable form. Phi is infinitely deep. Public observables are finite extractions. Those extractions are not failures. They are the very shape of science. We do not need infinity to be true. We need finitude to be certifiable. That is the finite jet sufficiency principle. Public reality is finite derivative. Salam. Peace be upon you.